globe. So lead us to that dimension. We have a Bernard, Mr. Bernard. He's a private sector. Let us know why you decide to go to Georgia to invest.
Working, or there we go. I don't have quite the energy level of the ladies that went in front of me, so, and having also flown in from Singapore, I'm going to be lazy and stay seated. It's great to see all of you and see a lot of familiar faces in the room as well, and thanks to the U.S. Institute of Peace and Heritage for hosting this. I'm a partner with Cerberus, which is an American private equity firm, fairly large. We manage about $40 billion in assets. Most of that is spread across the US and Europe, but I'm in charge of the Frontier Markets group within Cerberus, which means that my job is to basically find the contrarian bets, the smaller, more sort of off-the-radar markets that other people are not paying as much attention to, but where there's still a universe of very interesting opportunities. And I would posit that Georgia is the ultimate contrarian bet. Because when you talk to your average American or average European about Georgia, what comes to mind for them is, well, first of all, the U.S., the Georgia-Russia conflict that took place in 2008. That's still surprisingly fresh in people's minds. In fact, oftentimes when I talk to people, that's the first thing that they ask about. They say, well, Georgia, isn't that the place that had a war with Russia? So that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind, of course, are the occupied territories. The third thing that comes to mind for people is that it's a very small country, that it's a post-Soviet country. These are the associations that people have with Georgia. But when you travel to Georgia, you immediately realize that the reality could not be more opposite to all of that. And you've, of course, already heard all the statistics, so I won't repeat all the statistics. They're incredibly impressive. In terms of where Georgia ranks on ease of doing business, economic freedom, etc. But what I can tell you is that in actual practical reality, when you're on the ground, those statistics they're there for a reason. You go into the Georgian banks. First of all, you realize that 2 of them are listed on the London Stock Exchange and are absolute world-class banking institutions. You talk to the bankers at these banks. They have Wharton degrees. They have Harvard Business School degrees. They've worked at top-tier banks in the US or the UK. You go into the local hotels that were developed by local entrepreneurs. Of course, there's also the Marriotts and there's all the foreign brands there. Those are impressive, but there's local hotels in Georgia that, frankly, are right up there with the top hotels of the world, and are going to start branching out internationally. From a design standpoint, from a service standpoint, top-notch. You wouldn't think that you're in a frontier market. You would think that you're in the first world somewhere. You would think that you're in Switzerland or the US. You go into the government offices. On my last visit to Georgia, I had a meeting which was, by the way, at 10 p.m. At the Georgian Prime Minister's request, because he'd had such a busy day. So we meet at 10 p.m. on a Friday, and he's still basically in the middle of his workday. We had about a 45-minute meeting to discuss a few things. I walked out of that meeting, and I bumped into Minister Turnava and Minister Zalkalyani because they're about to have a cabinet meeting at almost 11 p.m. on a Friday. So there's an energy and a vigor and a focus in Georgia, and these statistics are not an accident. These statistics are a true reflection of the realities that exist in the market, and it's an incredibly impressive place. We've been investing in Georgia for about, I guess, 4 years now, primarily thus far in the hydropower sector. We've done a variety of investments in small and medium-sized hydropower projects. We have an office in Tbilisi. We have people on the ground in Tbilisi. We are now increasingly looking at using the Tbilisi office as a hub, not just for Georgia, but actually for the region, because that's the other part of the story, right? That's the other part of what makes Georgia actually not so much of a contrarian bet. And the Prime Minister in his remarks this morning already hinted at that, which is that Georgia sits in the Caucasus region, which is one of the fastest growing consumer regions in the world. And if you look at the broader Caucasus economy, setting aside Russia for a moment, so not counting Russia, the Caucasus economy is almost a $1 trillion economy with Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. This is a very sizable economy, and there's only one country, frankly, that you'd pick in that region to do regional business from, and that's Georgia. You wouldn't put a regional business in Armenia. You wouldn't put it in Azerbaijan. You would absolutely put it in Georgia. So that's the second part of the story. It's not just a Georgian market story, but it's a regional story. So we've been investing in hydropower. Now we're going to look regionally as well. And we're now exploring other areas in Georgia that we think are very interesting. Logistics and transportation, obviously, is top of the list. It's been mentioned multiple times today already that Georgia is right at the crossroads of north and south and east and west. That puts it in a prime position to serve a very important function for the movement of goods, not just through the region, but internationally. If you look at the map as well, and you sort of chart it all the way over to Central Asia, you see that Central Asia, frankly, doesn't have a lot of good ways to move goods out to international markets if they don't want to go through Russia and if they don't want to go through Iran, both of which, of course, present certain challenges. So Georgia is the friendly pro-Western corridor through which these goods can reach international markets. So we think Georgia is very interesting for logistics and transportation. Telecommunications, same thing. Its location makes Georgia a very natural place to route international data movements. And already a lot of Middle East data actually flows up and through Georgia and then over into Europe. Central Asia at the moment is not yet fully connected through, but for the same reasons why you wouldn't really want goods flowing from Central Asia out through Russia and Iran, you also wouldn't want data flowing out through those two countries. And Georgia presents a natural transit point for data. There's additional infrastructure that's needed to make that possible, but that's another very important thing. And tourism. Tourism is also something that, Georgia has huge potential. The numbers are already staggering. You have a country that has a population of about 4 million and is already doing about double that per year in tourists. So around 8 million per year in visitors, I should say, not just tourists, but visitors. So those are some of the areas. There's many others. And I'll conclude by offering 3 quick stories, which is a dangerous thing to say because I'll probably now forget one of them. But 3 quick stories that are examples of really why Georgia is a very special place to do business, and why these rankings are all really well deserved. So the first example I'll give you is broad kind of policy innovation and policy improvement. So in Georgia, this is constantly taking place, right? Again, it's not just in the statistics, but behind the statistics, there are policy innovations that are constantly occurring and that are being driven by the Georgian government. For example, just in the last couple of years, the Georgian government, without anybody pushing them to do so from the outside, changed certain provisions of the tax code to introduce what's called the Estonian model, which allows you to forego paying taxes on your profits as long as you're rolling those profits back into your company and using it to grow the business rather than distributing them out as dividends. And then more recently, the Georgian government has introduced some other very innovative new policies where if you set up a regional business in Tbilisi that is then focused also on markets outside of Georgia, so for example, on Azerbaijan or on Turkey, then there's also very special tax relief for the business and for any foreign employees who move to Georgia to be part of that regional business. So that's the kind of innovation that's constantly taking place. They're constantly thinking, how can we make Georgia more attractive, more investable? How can we make it a place that people actually want to come to because they realize it's a small country that maybe people aren't paying as much attention to. So that's sort of broad, constant policy innovation. That's number one. Number two is actual responsiveness to the needs of the private sector. So when we started our hydropower investment program in Georgia, we had a slightly unusual approach. Most people were either doing one large hydropower plant or one small hydropower plant. We were doing numerous small hydropower plants and then bundling them into basically a portfolio. And I won't bore you with all the details, but basically in order to do that, there was some special accommodations that we needed to ensure that the portfolio would have a unified and harmonized set of regulations that applied to each of the hydropower plants, so that we wouldn't have a portfolio with some that were under one framework, some under another. And you couldn't imagine another country, I think, where there would be such a professional engagement across the entire interagency. We were able to have meetings with the Ministry of Economy, with the Prime Minister's office. There were professionals within each of these agencies that were appointed, lawyers and so on, to liaise with us so that they could better understand why we needed this. It was absolutely a very impressive thing. And as a foreign investor, to go in and have such a professional experience, I can really only commend Georgia for that. And then the third example I would give you, also from hydropower, is legislative fixes when Georgia sees problems. So there's been some pushback in Georgia over the last year or so on hydropower, because there's some communities that are saying that they're not actually benefiting sufficiently from the hydropower plants that are being built there. The revenues are just going to Tbilisi, and that's resulted in some tension. So now the Georgian government is proposing a legislative fix where a portion of the taxes that are paid by the power plant will go straight into the community where the power plant is located. None of this stuff maybe sounds like rocket science, but you guys have all done business in many different parts of the world, or maybe you've followed how things go in different parts of the world. And governments are not usually this responsive and this professional and this quick to address problems. Georgia sometimes says that it wants to be the Singapore of the Caucasus, and frankly, and as somebody who lives in Singapore, I hear all the time countries saying, "Oh, I want to be the Singapore of East Africa." Well, we want to be the Singapore of whatever. We're gonna, the North Pole is going to be the Singapore of the Arctic Circle. But honestly speaking, Georgia is probably the one country that truly is on track to replicate the Singapore model. And so I can't say enough good things about the experience we've had there. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Alexander. By the way, Alexander, I think it sounds to me, at least you're giving me a very real and practical investment tip about a specific country. So I'll try to remember that country after this session. Alexander mentioned rocket science. Obviously, economic development, it's not a rocket science. What it requires is commitment and action. I mean, a lot of times we see, economic development is like getting on escalator. Receive money and some